Okay, well, tonight we have a treat. Our speaker, Arnold Bowlin, is someone I met when I was doing one of my classes in North Carolina. And he is like Mel Elliott that I also met doing one of my classes. And both of them got interested in a subject in the Word and developed it. And when I was talking with Arnold in North Carolina, he said how interested he was in intelligent design. I had mentioned some scientific stuff and we got in a conversation. And so I encouraged him. I said, well, why don't you pursue that? Why don't you develop that? So we parted our ways and I went and taught elsewhere and he kept on working on it. And so our paths met again when I thought about him and Old Testament history, because I wanted to do intelligent design, but even though I have a scientific interest and a scientific background, I hadn't pursued it that much, but I believed that he had. And so I got in touch and he's still working on it, but he's worked on the first 2 days at least of Genesis 1. And you know how we look at Genesis 1, how we look at the rest of the Word in many places, it's like a diamond. And it has many facets. And you can look at it one way and the light reflects one way. But you look at it another way and the light reflects beautifully in that way too. And so it's possible that the days could be eras, they could be days as well, because God's Word is that deep. So I'm going to turn it over to Arnold, and he and I will have like an open mic discussion, and Ren Minetti can chime in too, because Ren might have a few things to say. So what we're going to do is we're going to have an open conversation about intelligent design. Okay? So Arnold, you want to say a few words?
Hopefully more than a few, but do you still want me to share how I came to start doing that, researching science in the Bible?
Yes, sir, please.
Okay, but since you gave me such a wonderful introduction, I want to tell my side of it. When John came down to North Carolina for his meeting, when he taught his One Lord class, he made a statement at some point in the sessions that the scientists, the physicists, were just about to find out whether we existed in 5 dimensions or 11. So you could say that really got my attention. And when I heard him say that, I knew that I could talk to this guy. So I went up to him and told him what I was interested in, and I tried to quote a verse from Job 3:9 that went like, "Let the stars of the twilight thereof be dark," and I discovered that refers to the primordial stars sometime after the Big Bang. So I'm pretty sure that John remembered that, because you don't get too many people coming up to you making a statement like that. So that's, I was just impressed that John knew what he knew and was interested, because I wasn't sure if I could, make a go at this. There didn't seem to be a lot of open interest, but there wasn't really any serious objection to it either. So I was born in a city called Greensboro, North Carolina. It's a big town now of about 300,000. But my parents moved to Colfax, a small suburb community, when I was 3 or 4, and we lived in Colfax. And my dad was the principal of the school at Colfax, and my mother was a second grade teacher. So I was the principal's boy, or at least through the 8th grade anyway. But as a child, I wasn't all that interested in the Bible. It just seemed like a bunch of religion to me, especially when they were talking about the Trinity. And that was probably one of the big things that made me not interested. But then when, as a teenager, I got into Sunday school class, and they went over some of the Old Testament history, it started to sound like a classroom in school, and it was kind of interesting to me then, even as a teenager. And it was also about that time that I met my second mentor. My first mentor, I'll call the Way International, and that's only kind of in a general sense. But when I was about 15, I started getting interested in electronics. And there was a guy, an engineer, that came down to my aunt's house on Friday and Saturday night. And they would sit there, and she would knit. And then he would sometimes do crossword puzzles while the TV was on. But then I started coming down and sitting with him. And I began to ask him a bunch of questions about physics and chemistry and even math a little bit. And then he told me about this speaker design called Exponential, which he and some colleagues had developed for AT&T. Back then in the 50s, it was Western Electric. Then they got a patent on it. And by the time he told me about it, the patent was about to expire. So anyway, I just kept doing that, kept going over there on most weekends when other kids were cruising up and down the street. I was sitting there with Otis, that was his name, asking him a bunch of questions. And he seemed to enjoy it, and I really enjoyed it. So I started building those cabinets and changed it around a little bit. And then when I was 18, I went to High Point College and ended up with a degree in history and minored in math. And then when I was 23, a friend in High Point that happened to work where I was working at the time witnessed to me, and he said at one point when he talked about Dr. Wearable in the Powerful Abundant Living class, he made the statement that the Bible is scientifically accurate with a mathematical precision. So that really got my attention, because here was this theologian, and he's making references or inferences about the Bible being scientific. So that, I got to say, that was, a big reason why I got started taking the Powerful Abundant Living class. And so I went at it academically kind of whole hog. I had the advanced class 3 times within 2 years, and then went to the Way College of Emporia in 84 and 85. And I was hoping that someone had developed some research regarding science in the Bible, but nothing was done on it. So I still held out hope after that year at the Way College. Then around 87, the Way split up, and I was puzzled and disappointed by that. And by the middle of '87, I stopped going to fellowship. It got to be like going to church anyway. So it wasn't really fun anymore. And there was one thing I discovered in regards to the research back in '85, and there was a verse in Job that said, out of whose womb came the ice. And that, I didn't know it at the time, but that was imagery referencing the universe through fetal development in the mother's womb. But that's about all I was able to come up with at the time. So from '87 to 2009, that was kind of the dark ages, so to speak. I didn't do a whole lot. I still spoke in tongues, but it was just kind of a trickle. I wanted to make sure I could keep on doing it, but it seemed like there wasn't much motivation. So, but I still continued to talk to my friend Otis off and on through those years. And through him, I not only learned a lot of things about physics and engineering, but I guess by osmosis, I learned to experience what science is, even though it's not so much based on knowledge. And so that's looking back in retrospect. But then something happened in 2009. You might say I had a kind of epiphany, and all of a sudden I just got back into the groove again. And I started speaking in tongues a lot. In fact, it even made me cry, for a little while there. And I realized that God still liked me. And so I felt like I had to do some catch up starting about that time. So for a couple of years, I laid the speaking in tongues on pretty heavy relative to what a lot of people probably do daily. It's somewhat more than that. So for a couple of years, I started thinking, well, maybe I should try to pick up my research again. And then this feeling kept growing stronger and stronger to where I felt inspired to do it. And it was about that time that a lot of things came together for me. And probably one of the notable moments was when I discovered 1 Samuel 25:29. Part of that verse says, "The soul of my Lord is bound in the bundle of life." And so for some reason, that really got my attention because that sounded like a scientific statement. And it actually was. I didn't quite get it right initially, but I come to find out later that the words mean pressed into the bag of life, and that refers to the cell, and what got pressed into it was the mitochondria, which is the power pack of the cell. It's what keeps the cell active. And so that got me on the quest. I started to know how to do the research now. So I started developing some topics. Around 2014, I started doing some work in Genesis chapter 2 with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, how that relates in the broader picture to primitive man. And then I discovered that Christ had spiritual DNA, so I started writing a paper on that. But by that time, I'd started going back to fellowship. This time it was CFF. And I was trying to correlate the Luke 24:49, which basically says we are clothed with the Holy Spirit. So clothes are something you wear on the outside. And so then I found out later that there's a quantum energy field that surrounds DNA. And this verse in Luke, I think that Jesus was speaking that verse, wasn't he, John?
Yes.
And so there was a reference to heaven and the Holy Spirit and higher energy. So I got really excited. So then I developed, probably 5 or 6 others during that time. And then in 2015 is when I met John at his One Lord teaching seminar. and it's sort of been off to the races since then. There's been some slow periods, but I started to develop about 10 different topics over those years, and it's just been very exciting. And I hope that one day I'll convince somebody how exciting it is. So the last couple of years, I've been kind of slower. I've been a little preoccupied being co-executor of my aunt's estate, and that just took me off my game. So I didn't really feel like doing much until lately. Now that's all behind, and long story short, it had a very happy ending for me in terms of inheritance. And so that leads us up to the present. So now I want to make a few comments about how I do this research. And probably one of the most prominent thing is I take the best information from many sources, because I discovered that when the Bible describes events, it's not limited to one field of scientific study, or even history for that matter. It involves history, and whatever field is involved, I have to investigate whatever is necessary to make the connection. So that's what I do on that part. And then also as a researcher and a student, I have a responsibility to rightly divide God's word. And I might add that science has to be rightly divided as well, because it all has to be right. But it has yielded some very specific correlations here, which this topic of Genesis chapter 1, the first biblical day, there were some very specific verses when you look at the Hebrew words and you compare that against the events that astrophysicists know and have proven more or less as fact. I mean, it's just amazing when you start to see that, and that's what I'm going to introduce a little bit tonight to get started in it. And then another technique I use is to take a set of facts and events that have been established but don't seem to have any apparent relation when you just look at them one at a time. Like looking at each one doesn't really yield a lot, but when you step back and look at all of them, then you discover what the context is, and they're all related by the context. So it's a little bit like Columbo being a detective. He thinks outside the box from the other police, and he's able to solve the case that would otherwise have been unsolvable. And that's what I try to do with this research, is find an explanation or theory that accounts for things that we already know with little or no contradiction. And then I also like to observe how people look at the Bible and science. And I've observed that many people think there's little or no connection to be made between science and the Bible. And they have actually compartmentalized it. And then also people, when they study most anything and the Bible here, they expect to find a one-to-one correlation between what they're trying to compare, which is like saying if A, then B, and only B. But I found in this research that sometimes A equals B and C, and sometimes D. So everything just gets spread out, but it increases the pool of knowledge that gets taken into finding the connection whenever it's necessary. Now, some things do have a one-to-one correlation, more or less, but if you look into it deep enough, you'll find out that they are really more complex than that. In fact, this topic of Genesis chapter 1 is like that. It's about as close to one-to-one as you're going to get that I've found out so far. And just a few more, and then I'll get into it. Then I also take into account how most people perceive things who are not scientifically inclined. And I was raised to believe the Bible, to be a good boy and all that. and our parents attended the Presbyterian Church in Kernersville here, a town next to us. And so from them in the community, I learned how people look at the Bible. And for those who might have problems with what I'm researching here, I understand their objections because I know something about how they're looking at it. So I could go on a little bit about that, but let me get to what I'm going to begin to cover. I want to help people understand the Bible from a broader perspective. And some of the people, I hope, will have what is called sunesis. I think most everybody understands what that is. But when you find these connections between the Bible and science, and you start to see what the connection is, you're going to get very excited about it, because maybe for the first time in the person's life, they'll realize that science and theology are not the separate things we think they are. And then I also want to show that modern science can help us to understand the Bible better, because it kind of fills in the gaps that the scriptures don't specifically state, but it provides a lot of background and foundation to how or why those verses say what they say and where they say it. And that's what I'm looking for in general when I do this kind of research. But when I get into the first biblical day, all this will start to make a little more sense to you. So I'm going to begin with an overview. I'm going to mention specifically Genesis 1:1, and then I'm going to get into the events that followed the Big Bang, and I'm going to take it very slowly, because I know this is going to be challenging for some, but anybody who is scientifically inclined that has studied astrophysics and astronomy may already see where this is going. And then finally, I'll get to the primordial stars. But that subject, the primordial stars, is kind of the focus of the first day, along with Let There Be Light. And so that's kind of the way I'm going to go with it. Okay, a couple more things. I have a little paragraph, a couple paragraphs called A Word to the Reader. And what I try to do is try to balance between too little and too much content. Because if you tell them too little, it's not going to help them. And if you tell them too much, it'll just all blow by them. So that's not going to help them either. But this kind of information can't really be dumbed down like some other topics can, but it can be condensed. And I can talk about just one or two pieces at a time and show you more what it looks like than the actual science behind it. But that being said, if anybody out there understands the science, this is really going to get their attention, and they're going to get really excited. And I might add that if you get to the point where you begin to understand it, it'll make you cry. It will. In researching the Bible, I found if it was a board game, it's like playing a game of chess. If any of you play chess, I think you know what I mean. But I'm going to try to teach it as if it's checkers. So it'll be somewhat simpler. So I'd like to open up with the introduction here with 4 questions that I'll leave for the listener to ponder over. Number 1, if y'all can hear that, that's one of those alerts on my phone.
Okay, don't worry about it. Yeah, by the way, we had a challenge tonight because your internet went out because of a thunderstorm. So you're using your cell phone. So we know how important this is because the adversary has been fighting it. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's just way too coincidental that thunderstorm came over this area. Anyway, question number 1, how could the ancient prophets and writers in the Old Testament know about modern cosmology without a modern understanding of science and technology to study it? Number 2, why would God reveal this knowledge to them since it's beyond their comprehension and would mean nothing to them. Number 3, if astrophysicists, cosmologists, and others have figured out what actually happened, then why try to correlate it with the Bible? And number 4 is, would correlating science with theology be considered the holy grail of knowledge? And I'm kind of beginning to think that it just might be. So I'll leave these questions for you all to ponder. So now just getting into Genesis 1:1, of course, we all know that says in the King James it reads, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But Bible scholars who've studied it in other texts say it should read, God in the beginning created the heavens and earth. So God is the first word in the Bible. And I think that's very appropriate. So now let's go back to the 1500 BC when Moses was alive and the time that he wrote this, all of Genesis and his other books. So I'm thinking that the idea of what creation was not all that complicated for him. And he, along with the other people that lived at that time, had only their 5 senses to evaluate the world around them. And mostly it was sight. So now I got to say, give some kudos to Moses. He was trained in all the ways of the Egyptians. I think there's a verse that more or less paraphrases that, but he had the highest academic education available to anybody. But even that was not enough to give him our modern view of the universe. Moses and everybody else saw creation as the biosphere and the stars that lie beyond it. And then, of course, there's the deep, which is another subject in and of itself. And if I were to expand this further out, I would have to include the deep as a subtopic because it figures prominently in Genesis 1 and also in Job. And then there's other books it's mentioned too. So those things being said, people of that time thought that there was a firmament and that stars were just points of light. And if all they were points of light, they shouldn't be that far away. Now, this is the 5 senses. And remember again that you don't know any science, any modern science that would help you to figure this out. So Moses did not know that the stars were very distant suns. So this is essentially the ancient view of creation. And there's a popular diagram that's called Ancient Hebrew Cosmology. Can't show you the picture now, but it depicts fairly precisely, I think, how the ancient Hebrews viewed creation. And I might point out here that when Moses wrote verse 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, it wasn't a great big universe that got created to him. It was just the biosphere and the stars that were resting on top of the firmament. So the idea of the universe didn't come along until the 5th century, when one of the Greeks, Democritus, proposed that all matter in the universe was composed of atoms. And he also proposed that space was an infinite void that contained these atoms. Of course, that's not entirely correct, but this is the progression of thought as the centuries passed. So now I've probably gone long enough here, so I'll just end with asking the question. So we, living in the 21st century, should be asking, just what was it that got created in Genesis 1:1? So, John, if you want me to stop there, that'll be fine. I know you don't want to go too long.
Well, we can take a break. You wanted to get into chapter 1 a little bit in the first day, didn't you?
Yes, I started into that, and there's a little bit more of that to go. But I was just trying to be courteous to the people listening.
Well, we can take a short
So you
break.
want to take a break?
Yeah, we can
Okay.
take a short break. And by the way, you did great. You know, we
Thank you.
This is your first time really publicly speaking, and I think you did a wonderful job. So anyway.
Well, it's the first time. Yes, it's not quite the first time, but it's still really new to me, and especially not over the phone like this.
Let's take a break. And cool. Well, we'll get into
that's
that.
Still coming up.
Yeah, I'd like to get into that a little bit to give people some substance about what you've been working and get them exposed to some of your findings. Like I said, this is like a gem, and there's many different ways of viewing it, but I think we do need to bring out how science and the Bible can fit together. So let's take a short break.